Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krish and guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. Now, my guest this week is unusual because he's a friend of mine, and I think I should probably begin by telling you a little bit about who I think Rob Rinder is. Of course, he's hugely well known across TV as Judge Rinder, and Rob Rinder, who pops up on breakfast TV and daytime TV and comedy shows and entertainment, and he's had his own chat show, and he's a TV star, but he's also a very accomplished lawyer and has had an involvement in all sorts of interesting cases. He's made some fascinating documentaries about his Jewish history and the Holocaust. And Rob, I think, is one of my favourite people because I always say he's a really serious person wrapped up in a really funny, entertaining rapper. So let's work out who he is. Rob, welcome to the podcast.
What a joy. I don't think I've ever been introduced with more sort of gusto or more sort of jazz-handed dishonesty than that. But I mean, you know.
I am right, aren't I, to say you are fundamentally quite serious. But you hide it well.
This type of thing that a kind of wearying head of year would say. In my case, when I used to show up to school, which was faintly rarely, you know, punctuated with a cigarette, you know. It's a fascinating point, and I think it's fair to say, yeah, I suppose I am. And the reason I know I am is because the only time I ever feel really uncomfortable, I guess that's the best way of describing it, is when people around me either assume that I'm stupid or are perhaps snobby because of the nature of the work that they're aware that I've done on television. I mean, insofar as I'm serious, I care deeply about things, I think deeply about things, and to that extent, insofar as that seriousness, yeah, that really does matter to me. At the same time, I'm always mindful of never overly displaying seriousness and never confusing it with that rather crass form of intellectual virtue signalling, which I just can't stand. Or as I think as Maya Angelou recently, I was watching an interview, perhaps the last she gave with Anderson Cooper. It's beautiful. And she was asked by him about her relationship with, you know, the great activists of the 60s, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, and she said we used to cry together, but of course we used to laugh together too. These were deeply serious people, she said, but I don't trust people who walk around being serious, like they've got glue on the back of their hand. You know, you're serious, maybe, but you're boring as all hell. And I think the idea that you have to be one thing isn't uniquely British, but there's a certain kind of British complexion to it, that people are uncomfortable if on the one hand you want to do jazz hands and make them laugh and are silly, at the same time is also holding sacred the deeper books as well. People don't really like that. They want you to be one thing.
Well, I mean, the one thing I suppose you could be, but are not as a practicing lawyer. So so how is it that you are a lawyer but you're an entertainer, and which is the foremost?
Gosh. Well, I mean, no, it's a difficult one. I mean, it wasn't like I woke up one morning and gave up, right? And thought, you know, enough with all this international law. What I really need to do is the cha-cha. I mean, it was a series of kind of random events that led me into television. I never applied, and that's important. But nevertheless, by the time I ended up on television, and what will Lucy perhaps describe as doing other work in another sphere, I had lost the mission. It's a lovely Yiddish word, the koyach, the strength, the desire, the purpose of what I was doing. I hadn't appreciated that till I'd got into television. So I was very lucky in practice. I mean, some of your listeners will know that being a barrister, it's a little bit like being an actor. I mean, not in the way people think. It's not performing, because the instant a jury or a judge thinks that you're being performative, it's over. They don't trust you. I mean, it is facts, despite there being undoubtedly a serious element of ego and performance. But very early on, I had a lucky break where I was cross-examining a police officer, and a very influential solicitor noticed me and gave me work early on. So I was doing serious work, and then eventually the long and short of it was graduated into doing kind of international law. and came back from a rather challenging case to go and defend. I did back-to-back gang cases, and then I was defending a case in Croydon. No offence to Croydon, but if you're already a bit blue, it's certainly not going to improve the flavour of your mood much. The point is that it was a very challenging case, and I'd really lost, having gone from being a poacher to becoming a gamekeeper. In other words, I defended, then was prosecuting cases abroad, building cases, and I came back after this long period of prosecuting to return to defend, as I say, in this very challenging matter. And I would get up every morning and feel completely depleted. Every morning I would go in to defend this person and just hate myself, hate what I was doing. And I was just in this complete nadir of bleakness. At the same time as writing these scripts, and it was just a hobby, random hobby, and I knew the odd person, over the years from university. And I went to flog one to this woman, and she said it was the worst thing she'd ever read. I mean, she sort of gave it, I think I've described it in the past as her aggressively undivided indifference. So a combination of all of the above. But she seemed fun to me. So I came back to Croydon and I speed read one of her chick lit novels. She describes as chick lit. Don't get angry out there. And it made me laugh. And of course, it had all sorts of human geography that I had hitherto been unaware of. Just because you've read the brochure, it doesn't mean you're going on the package tour. That's all I'm going to say. And she thought it was rather amusing. She said, do you want to meet this person who's trying to do a court show? Never met anyone. I said, yeah, great. Manchester next week. Fast forward, I was instructed by the government of Jersey to advise on their independent care inquiry, which was a long and challenging, to say the least, inquiry they held into historic child abuse. And then I flew over to do Judge Rinder. And case number one, a woman suing her wedding photographer. Thank you for bringing your mother to court. It's obviously a wise thing to do. That's my sister. And it wrote itself. And, I felt like I was channeling Basil Fawlty, from Fawlty Towers. As I tried to explain this woman, I'm awfully sorry. How do you find kind language? Say, well, that's what you look like, madam. There's nothing I can do about it, Case number two, though, was really profound and important in this regard. I said, having advised oligarchs and international governments where what's at stake are billions of pounds, and where there are international issues which are complex and nuanced. And in this case, I said something like, well, this case is worth £80. That's not a lot of money. I got this coughing in my ear, and the senior producer of the programme is from the Black Country to the north of Birmingham. She says, do you want to rephrase that? You sound like a right posh dickhead. And of course, wave after wave, case after case, that's what was at stake. And the gift of it was then, and hopefully will endure, to have a real window into the lived experiences of people outside of the bubble of my London privilege. And it's deeply serious. And there's never a moment where I shut the door behind me and think, will this be funny for telly?
But the court is a real legal arbitration, isn't it? It's not just a TV show.
No, it's binding. I mean, it's more of a kind of creature of contract than it is under the Arbitration Act. So you and somebody else agree contractually that I will arbitrate the dispute and it's final. Isn't
there something also that the programme takes us to, which is also about the extent to which ordinary people have access to justice? And that justice is really expensive. It's generally for rich people. And if you're ordinary, it's quite difficult.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very a neat way. I mean, you are a master of, elbowing me into my real platform. Yeah, that's right. And I care about that deeply, as everybody should. The reality is that there is no meaningful rule of law unless you have access to justice. Unless you have the power to get justice, and what I mean by that is the things that you're entitled to. If you've been wronged, that you have some species of remedy. If you're seeking some kind of social mobility, by some kind, I mean access to decent schooling or housing, and you have a statutory entitlement to that you have access to it. And when confronted by authority, there's somebody standing in the way and they're wrong, you have the meaningful capacity to access that remedy. And for millions, if not most people in our country, that simply isn't available. Full stop. So in every walk of life, especially in civil law, it's been removed almost entirely. That means if you've got a family dispute, the reality is you're very unlikely to get legal aid. Now, think about the mischief, as we would say in law, but the sheer emotional violence that's done for children. If you're somebody that's seeking your entitlement to accommodation, again, and you're ignored, one good legal letter, one bit of access to good network can usually help. You're likely to be ignored. You don't know anyone. There's no access to legal aid to resolve that problem for you. If you've got a kid that has special educational needs, again, very often the law is on your side, but there's no remedy for you. And that's not just blandly wrong. It's a sort of very basic affront to the fundamental principle of our democracy.
And do you think there's something more profound about Britain in this, and that parts of our identity, or English identity at least, is to do with we believe in the rule of law, and law and justice are fundamental to what our country is about and fundamental to our democracy. Yet, as you say, for so many people, I mean, we're recording this on the day that Dominic Cummings is giving evidence to MPs and talking about all the dreadful things that went on in government, for which, for most people, there won't be any recourse to justice. He's talking about people who are infected in care homes and how hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people, needlessly died. If I just look at the news today, is what I mean, without going into the specifics of those, you could quite easily think, well, there is no justice in this country.
Yeah, I mean, look, the things you say are right, but that's kind of macro stuff. In other words, you're talking about big failure of government and people having access to legal recourse when government has failed. And there are a number of reasons, policy reasons, for example, why, let's say, a vaccine rollout doesn't go well, or let's say government policy fails, why there might be limitations on you, for example, claiming against a government in those circumstances. And usually the legal principle in the circumstances is the slippery slope argument, or the floodgates argument. Government can't be liable for everything. One has to look at good faith and understand that government does its very best. Now, whatever you think of that, wherever you think about the machinations and the grim, ugly politics of Dominic Cummings et al., is perhaps, to me, less important than what happens in real lived experiences and real lived communities in our country. And, I think about the common experiences between, let's call them what they are now, the red walls, as I receive their letters. As I read the letters of people and the experience of people in Bolsover and Sedgefield and, of interest, Hartlepool, what you realise very quickly is the lived experiences of those communities, because there isn't one, is not just common, but it is almost a direct echo of the lived experiences of, for example, my Bangladeshi communities in South London. And what common threads do they have? Exactly as I was talking about before. In the event that there's some sort of problem, there is no recourse to justice. And what I mean by recourse is this: it doesn't necessarily mean going to court. It means that you have access to power, that you have the capacity to be heard, that you have agency through the capacity and ability to be an advocate, to stand up and to speak to power, to form meaningful political organisations or social organisations that get listened to. And one serious element of it is that it goes alongside with the absence of an access to a network of people that can help them. And what I mean by that is, for you and me, if something goes wrong in our lives, we are one telephone call away, one person, one human being away from somebody who can help us or has the capacity to help us. Not necessarily for free, although in both of our cases, our privilege is such that that's almost certainly the case, certainly at first. For most people, that is simply not the case. And so that's what I reflect upon. And nowadays, access to justice and access to all of the things that are necessary, they are the critical alchemy for social mobility. In other words, for people to rise above the challenging situations and circumstances they find themselves in, which should be the mission of every forward-thinking society, every forward-thinking government, every government of any decency. Those networks are less available now than I think they were years ago. And that is the articulation of privilege.
So in the absence of networks for most people, you need to create structures, don't you? So how could you fix this?
Well, I mean, certainly I'm not running for government, not on Twitter, you can imagine. I mean, I did think of it, but who wants to be that hated and earn that little money? I mean, no one's doing a fun run. I don't know, and I wish I did. There are three things I would say off the top of my head, not being prepared to answer that question. One, it's really bloody hard to make a case for legal aid, right? Partly, it's the lawyer's fault, and any lawyer that says it's not is lying. For a long period of time, there were some, as there always is, lawyers that ruined it for everybody else, undoubtedly. I have to call that out, just as you do bad journalists in your field, just as you do bad doctors, etc. But the first thing is that people must have access to quality legal advice in order to be empowered. That's the first thing. Secondly, when we talk about social mobility, we need, I think, now more than ever, to identify this, that the biggest barrier to what we're loosely describing as social mobility, I'm talking about access to power, is class in our country. Now, that's to some extent a controversial thing to say, and there are other, what people might describe as intersectional dynamics at play, I'm certain of it. But nevertheless, what I worry about deeply is the Hartlepool and the Bolsovers and the Sedgefields, those communities who are constantly told post-Brexit that they are racist, that they feel forgotten and at arm's length from any kind of meaningful political power or personal agency, force, capacity to make change, that they need to be heard and listened to just as other communities do, and that to remind that, for those communities to understand that they have precisely the same in common as I keep referring to, the various communities of colour that I work alongside as well. And instead, I think the current political debate does more to divide them, when our original sin in our country, we refer to England, and I think you specifically refer to England for this purpose, is that class is what divides them more than anything else. Now, thirdly, how do they affect that power and change? By demanding it, by political organisation. I mean, the Brexit vote was one example of it. It was a punch in the face to the established community. I don't think people are any more tribally conservative or especially think that Boris is good, but they are tired of being in those communities or being ignored.
So how have you created the life that you've created? I mean, where do you come from? You don't come from privilege and...
No. People think, because of the way I sound, people think that I've been mugged by a Mitford. And it's interesting, because I grew up in Southgate down the road from Amy Winehouse. My dad's a black taxi driver, and I think personal stories do matter. They kind of inform and colour the threads of you. And my mum was a single mum, but because it's often the way, very emotionally rich and intelligent. And she went off in a very separate direction from my dad, but insisted that we maintained an ongoing relationship, to say the very least. In other words, she never projected any toxicity onto that relationship, despite, I'm confident, every reason to and every justification. So because it was constantly present in my dad's life, he was extremely working class, growing up in a very working class community. But then gradually, my mum sort of growing in every sense, intellectually, financially, she ended up running a publishing house, which when you think of where she started was truly unthinkable. That kind of permeated into everything. But for me, I think, there are other dynamics, you might say, complexions at play, which is, of course, I knew I was gay and different. I didn't like football. So, that was out. I went to Tottenham Hotspur, which is much more my family religion, certainly, than Judaism really was. When I came out to my brother, I was talking about this on another programme, but I don't think I've ever said this before. But his response, and he meant it. I mean, he's the opposite of me, absolutely nothing performative, communicates with his friends through some prism of Neolithic grunt. I don't understand a word they're saying, you know. And he said, when I said, I'm gay, he said, well, as long as you're not Arsenal. And he meant it. And he really meant it. And I would fall asleep, you know, my dad would take me, you know, the hideous smell of that grotesque cacophony of mince pies and urine, and sort of fall asleep. And I woke up, I must have been 7 at half time, and asked whether it had started yet. So I had no grammar. And they'd take me to, you know, places like Hatfield House. I couldn't believe they were bringing me home when this is where my family lived, you know, desperate to go to boarding school, very aware, in other words, and built this identity oppositionally. I'm sure a therapist would have a lot to say about it, but it is what it is. And in the community I grew up in, interestingly, a sort of suburb of London, again, the nationality and racial complexion was infinitely less important than class, in such a powerful way that by the time I got to the bar and you would be prosecuting cases, and you would, in the early days, I think it's still the case, you would make identifications on ICT1, they were the racial complexion of whoever the suspect was. I was just terrible at it. It's a nonsense to say, and false to say you don't notice the pigmentation of someone, but it's not the first thing you see, right, if you grow up in London. I mean,
So being Jewish wasn't the most important thing of your identity when you were little?
It was different. I mean, my grandfather's narrative was at the centre of it all. But as I say, I came back, I was Jewish, Greek Cypriot, Nigerian. My mum was much happier, me playing up the road with a Nigerian doctor's family, you see. You know, they were respected. That was a go and play with that family, rather than, you know, somebody down the road who may have been Jewish but whose dad had gone to prison or on holiday for 3.5 years for fraud. But yeah, the Jewish culture was absolutely front and centre. My grandfather's story was much more powerful. It was a Jewish identity, but it's very specifically a Holocaust survivor's Jewish identity. We would go, we were religious, and by that I mean observant. So, you know, that meant going to synagogue on Saturday. I never ate non-kosher food till I was, I think, 13, and tried my own lobster, and just couldn't really at that point. Plus, at that point, I figured in the great scheme of celestial mitigation, if there is a heavenly court, I'd have a lot more to answer for then than just eating a lobster, right?
Well, then go back to sort of being gay and young. I mean, when did you work it out?
It's that's such a sliding kind of memory, because of course it's so impossible to know. I constantly relitigate my own past and cast myself as the hero of my own narrative, especially when I'm on a treadmill or running across a desert. You know, I don't know, as early as I can remember, probably I formed a sort of gay identity. But
so when did you tell your mum?
When I was 21 and just starting the bar. I was too young. You see, I was a bit ahead at school, and I went to the bar too young, actually, I think, in hindsight. But there it is. And I'd fallen in love for the first time. And, you know, it's impossible to overstate, love, how different it was coming out in the 90s, early 2000s, the late 90s, thereabouts. You know, when I was growing up, you know, there was no, I use the word on purpose, normal reflections of gay sexuality at all. We're talking to each other not long after the anniversary of Section 28, right? Now, some people know what that was, which specifically banned the speaking about sexuality in school, gay sexuality, etc. And what I mean by normalcy, I mean there was nothing. You know, if you think about, if you're born heterosexual, there are the beginnings of your identity reflected back at you in basic literature from the famous five. You might sort of, this one fancies the other, etc. So you have a more safe sense of who you are. There was nothing like that. You then throw in the emotional terrorism of how the HIV/AIDS epidemic was reported, and that was a reality in the 80s. And then when there were gay relationships that were on mainstream television, which was the cultural epicenter of our house, you know, my upbringing was all columns and no books, right? Still the case. You know, I walk around my mum's house going, oh, lovely, I'm just getting 50 tellies, where's the books? But you know, when there was a gay relationship on EastEnders. Colin and Barry, you might remember. You definitely don't seem like a Dynasty type, but there was Stephen and Bart. These were matters of national scandal. And they never ended well, right? They ended in death and negativity, and they were met with, public, I'm going to use the word opprobrium, but hate, really. And so when I had to come out to my mum, for her, it wasn't just depriving her of the narrative that she had held sacred and mattered to her, which was that I was going to marry a Jewish girl and hopefully have children, etc. That was one piece of inevitable mourning that she would have to do. It was also really scary because it didn't end well for gays. It was a decades where one's sexuality was completely cloaked in shame. And so for years, I lived with that shame.
We were both in the National Youth Theatre as kids. And
what did you do out of interest?
I did 1 year. I did a workshop year, and I'd been in the Manchester Youth Theatre before that. And I sort of dreamt about being an actor, but then was going to be a doctor, and then sort of fell into television. You sort of you kind of sort of made the journey sort of around, haven't you? I suppose from sort of, I guess, dreaming about something, but then going for the serious option to coming back to entertainment. I mean, is that really where you're happy?
Yeah, I'm
happiest.
Yeah, maybe that's a good question. Who knows if you're happy? I mean, I worry about the idea of what is happiness because, I don't know. There are days where I've had the most brilliant things happen, ridiculous things. And I'm sort of worried about the most tangential thing that's going on. And all of a sudden, sort of 2 years later, I retrospectively go back and think, oh, shit, I forgot. That's brilliant. I
mean, is there a lesson, is what I'm getting at, of sort of following your real dream?
Yeah, to an extent. But also, one of the real issues for many people is that, there's a great big buffet of life. And people have more than one talent, if you're lucky enough, which is a lot of people. And I think the unhappiest people are those where there were a variety of options. And they go, oh, I chose that. And they go, blooming heck, I should have chosen the fish. And they live perpetually in the imagination, the romanticisation of the choice that they didn't make. And I think depression, or unhappiness, perhaps a better way of putting it, in fact, I emphasise unhappiness and not depression, exists in the chasm between the life you imagine and the one that you're having every day. It's true of your relationships, etc. The projection that you have of what would have been versus actually what's going on, and you're never going to be your best self if you're lost in that particular black hole. I don't know. I know I would have been a rubbish actor, love. I mean, I would have ended up with like a fifth-rate part on Heartbeat. I was lucky because National Youth was amazing when we did. I mean, real talent, right? And I remember, I could fake it, right? So I would watch people reading Shakespeare, like, and or when I saw Benedict Cumberbatch act for the first time, it's not a fake story that I've sort of made up for the papers. It was true. He just read it. And I was like, okay, that's it, Like a fifth-rate artist, like coming across Turner for the first time. Or me, some like plonk piano player, I don't know, hearing Chopin and going, oh, love, yeah, I better stick to the day job. I know that I could get, if I worked really hard, and I could, but it would never be great or good enough. And I think, there's no problem with that. I think being aware to some extent, within reason, of your limitations that you set for yourself, never listening to what other people tell you about it, those opinions don't matter, ever. But having an instinctive sense of what you're being good at and reaching for that is great. But in my case, it's all been a series of lucky events. It's not like when I planned to do any of this stuff. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to do the cha-cha and that sort of thing.
Just to come back to sort of the identity thing, I mean, because so many of your references are Jewish, Yiddish, you've got a story for everything. Why is this identity important to you? What do you get from it? Because it's not really about religion, is it?
I don't know. I know that being Jewish and being gay has perhaps conscripted me to see the world as an outsider. Perhaps also given me a sense of insecurity provided an intuitive sense of placing myself always in the position of thinking about what it means to be a person who has no power. But that being said, I worry about the way in which identity has become the chief way in which we trade or we throat clear before we talk about political issues in a very serious way. I mean, whatever it is, it could be Palestine, Israel, it could be troubles in Ireland, it could be any number of things. What has increasingly happened, undoubtedly encouraged, exacerbated by social media, is that how you feel about a certain issue, and I emphasize the word feel, is to an important extent, I think, it sits in the emotional hemispherical cortex of the brain. In other words, there's no point in a lot of arguments deploying facts or logic. It's not going to land or change anybody's mind. That's not how people communicate in these medium, right? So, things are neatly packaged into very simple oppositional forces. So big versus small, the developed world versus the undeveloped world, etc. You don't need any more nuance than that. But much more powerfully, in all of these arguments, it's bound up in people's identity. So where you stand on Palestine or Israel or Ireland or perhaps a trans issue or issues or LGBTQ issues, etc., it isn't up for discussion in part, and I understand why some of the issues are very sensitive and have to be discussed with profound care. They sit in the part of the brain where identity rests. And so when I'm perhaps giving you some counter-narratives, perhaps about illegal settlements, for example, to a Jewish person and to an Israeli, for example, I'm attacking your identity and your right to exist. True of somebody who perhaps has a different point of view. True of discussions around sexuality, where I'm attacking something which is so fundamental to you that you feel threatened, so threatened that there's no part of you that is able, moving forward from that moment, to be able to have a rational, thoughtful conversation.
So how do you resist being pushed into these positions yourself, whereby, threads of anti-Semitism or the vociferousness of the identity politics pushes you into a political stance on Israel, for example, or the recent Gaza war that you don't naturally want to be in?
Not wanting to be in, there's two answers to that question. The first one is that it's not quite an answer to your question. The first thing is anybody that's got an intuitive, instinctive proclivity, lots of long words for hate or for shouting, right, is by their very nature an unhappy person or just an angry person. It means you're not a good advocate. Now, part of that dispassion comes from years of being at the bar. And as I said earlier, an identity where I always want to understand, feel comfortable in knowing both sides of the argument. But, when I first started as a barrister, people will be aware of this. There is a cab rank rule, which means you have to defend whomever without fear or favour. I used to represent the National Front. Imagine me showing up with my jazz-handed oy vey. And they were perfectly happy, to say the very least, to have me. But I stared into the face of real misery. And these were people with residual energy at the end of the day to shout at each other and to invest in hate or invest in anger of any political kind. And because of that, they lived lives of real emotional privation in an absence of any kind of richness that any of us would aspire to. That's the first thing, which isn't quite the answer to your question. The other thing is I do get involved in political conversations around identity politics, for example. I spoke only the other week at an LGBTQ society at Oxford, and I'm troubled by their conversations, not because I don't think they're important, but because I think a lot of the conversations they're having are the politics, as we come back earlier, the politics of Western privilege. And so I understand, and they may be right and have a very important point to make about whether or not one's Grindr choices are racist, right? To listeners out there, if you don't know what Grindr is, look it up, but don't download it. You'll worry people. That may be very important. And they may also worry about pronouns. Again, I think that's something we need to discuss and think about. to say the very least. You know, there are big things going on, and you've only got a finite amount of political capital and currency to use. And yes, you can do things more than once, but you have to deploy it sensibly and in a way that has some sort of strategic power, right? So if you are the privileged LGBT communities in Oxford, what are you doing triaging the issues and using all of your political currency there when there are LGBTQ youth who are homeless, likely to be the subject of violence, where there are countries in the world where people will be murdered because of their sexuality? That's what matters. I worry about that, seriously. In the context of Israel-Palestine, for example, there is no point in me entering the political fray with a series of competing facts because, as I say, it's so bound up in identity, nobody's listening, nobody cares. So what I'm convinced of now more than ever is that to be an effective advocate for either side, you need three things. And it's partly bound up in the work that I want to do and the reason I made the Holocaust documentary. The first thing is, very often when people are angry, if not always, they want to be heard. And they want to know that you've heard what they've had to say. The very act of saying, I hear you. If you can do it with sincerity, it's better. If you can do it honestly, it's even better. The second thing is, and this is if you're trying to change someone's mind. As a throat clearing, naturally, you need the counterfacts, you need to know your facts, but they very much exist as the prologue to what happens next. If you really want to affect somebody's point of view, once you've done those two things, I've heard you, and actually I think these are the facts, respectfully, but I'd like to tell you a story. And I think now more than ever, and again, it's why the importance of your work, I think, matters, and good, honest, well-funded, I emphasise that, properly well-funded journalism about things in the world we don't know about is now more important than ever. That those stories, human stories where we, either me doing a documentary or the extraordinary work that you do, getting out of the way and letting the person speak for themselves, have the power to change people's political complexion, their point of view, to gift somebody, even for a moment, the ability to hear and listen to one another. I think that's now sort of more important than ever, actually.
So how did you feel during this round of fighting?
It's very difficult. You know, I mean, it's a good question. How did you feel? I don't get drawn into Israel-Palestine discussions. I have been a vocal supporter of, for example, Mogen David Adom, which is the Israeli ambulance service that works alongside the Red Cross in the various Palestinian territories. And I could, throw out a whole series of boring platitudes which would put you into a coma going, oh, he's not answering the question. And the reason I'm not answering the question, is always important to tell a journalist why you're not, is because I would very much like to make a programme about Israel-Palestine, which does precisely what the Holocaust, My Family and Me did, that documentary I made, which is effectively to talk about what happened in 48 in the Declaration and get out of the way and allow the people who are there, many of whom are about to, they're a dwindling population because they're dying, those who remember what it was to stand on that ground, and allow them to tell their stories. And I worry that if I were to express a view, it would be misinterpreted and my capacity to get the money to make that programme would be affected. That's why I'm not answering that question. I will tell you, I certainly how Jewish people feel. I also hear and am aware of various things that are happening in the West Bank. I'm not new to the table. I mean, anybody that knows me will know I have colleagues and friends that work in the territories and are perfectly aware of what's going on. That's a long-winded answer without you getting one. But, I think before we even answer the question about how one feels about it, there's just so little knowledge out there. And the starting point, based upon what I was saying before, can't be just people with shouting, competing facts and narratives. That gets nowhere. What does matter is talking about what happened in 48, Jews of Mesopotamia, right? Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Yemen, either expelled or leaving a country to go to a land of, for them, promise. Holocaust survivors, some who leave China, who go round the world to drink the sand of Haifa. To a friend of mine whose grandmother is now living in a refugee camp in southern Lebanon, who's from Caesarea and knew what it was to smell the olive groves on the land of her birth, which is now, I think, part of a Hilton hotel, to what it means to be on the West Bank and to reach be at fingertips reach from the land that your family have had for centuries. Now, it's not for me to speak for it, but I think a programme, or at least a starting point where we get to hear the voices of what that land means to them and why, is at least perhaps an important contribution and a starting point for any mediation or discussion. And that's not the discussion we're having. Instead, we're shouting at each other counter-narratives, which of course don't land, because this isn't an issue of logic, it's one of identity.
So if you could change the world any way you like, wave a magic wand, what would you do?
Oh my God, the difficulty is it's so hard not to answer that and sound like, a fifth-rate Jonas brother of some description. What would I do? I'd give humanity a greater capacity for hearing. That's it. It's different from listening. That's a starting point for everything. And once you've heard, being able then to have the emotional range, intelligence, hopefully the gift of vocabulary to move forward. And in all of the noise that we have, so much of it now more than ever, and all of the social media addiction, which is what it is, it's an endorphin horror of an addiction, to be able to hear one another would be how I would change the world at first. Then, of course, I'd redecorate it. I always think, like, if I met Mother Nature, which may happen, who knows? I always think my luck, there'll be God, and I'll be behind some blameless nun. She'll get elbowed to a cloud with a sea view. And I think, what am I going to say? But I thought, in my last moment before I get nudged to the fire escape, I've got some notes, on on certain things. I mean, you look around, you think, what? But that was an odd thing to create. I mean, what's a giraffe? But I'm always perennially delighted by the heavenly campness of the universe. One only needs to go scuba diving to see that. Or just look at an ostrich. You can imagine Mother Nature bringing that to God and her going, oh, fabulous, I love the feathers. Anyway, sorry, I don't know how we got onto that.
Rob Rinder, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for sharing your ways to change the world.
No, it's been a delight and a joy, love.
Been a pleasure to speak. Our producer is Rachel Evans, and you can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.